Well, I want to welcome everyone to our evening together tonight. And we have a couple of, my name is Carla, and I'm going to be kind of hosting with you tonight. And we have a few little housekeeping things that we like to talk about at the beginning. So we like to kind of remind people who Take Part is and what our mission is. And the mission is to confront racism and to engage in dismantling the systems that perpetuate this ingrained racial inequality. So we do it in events, education, and outreach that foster engagement in community building. And we want all people to be treated with equality and respect. So when we do a presentation, we like to remind ourselves that we have a wide variety of people who come and speak with us and a lot of different opinions about how to approach this. So we like to know that the opinions and the views are actually the views of our speakers. And, you know, they don't necessarily reflect Take Part, but I have not been to a speech yet where I didn't feel really aligned with it. So it's great to have lots of presenters. We also have started putting up a slide that really wants us to acknowledge and affirm that the Portland area is the rightful homeland of the Cathlamet, Clackamas, Chinook peoples, Tualatin, Kalapuaya, and Molalla, and the many other Native people who live here, who have always lived here, and who have always belonged and cared for the land. This effort is made part throughout a lot of volunteer activity and in part by the local spiritual assembly of the Baha'is of Portland and from individual donors like you who contribute money to allow us to pay for things like Zoom service. So we also do it in partnership with the Association for Human Advancement and Development, which is a not-for-profit really committed to community growth. We have a couple of really simple communication agreements that we'll just look at. And the primary thing is to listen. Listen more and listen, especially if you're uncomfortable, and really try to hear the other person. We're all fine with having difficult conversations. Tension's a little bit okay if we have, got to work our way through to understand each other, but not drama. And one of my favorites is wait. Why am I talking? So sometimes, if you've expressed the view and others haven't had a chance, it's a really nice one to remember. Consultation and collaboration is the goal. This is not a competition to see who can speak the most. And most importantly, we want a safe environment for difficult conversations and learning. So it's great to take away the lessons and the insights that we gain, but we try to leave behind the who said what in a conversation. So when it comes to questions and answers, we're going to do a couple of things tonight. And Dr. Chappell or Pastor Chappell will also explain it to us as he starts his presentation. But if you are familiar, in the reactions box, there is a hand that you can put up. And we really like it if you can use your chat to put questions in. We have a couple of people who will monitor that and try to make sure that everyone gets heard tonight. So we'll kind of go through that again at the end of our introduction. And we try to keep our comments concise and respectful so everyone has a chance. This is great. So part of what I'm honored to do tonight is to introduce Pastor Chappell. I personally first met Pastor Chappell when we were working with the Portland Baha'i Faith and Pastor Chappell's church to jointly and collaboratively put on 3 vaccine clinics and to actually do that in the St. John's neighborhood. I learned so much about him since then, and it's a pleasure to work with both him and his wife, Diana. The two of them have been together about 46 plus years, which is really lovely. Pastor Chappell's been in ministry for 40 plus years, including 35 years as a senior pastor. And he currently serves as a pastor of the St. John's All Nations Church of God in Christ in Portland, over in the St. John's area. It's a multicultural, multi-ethnic church. I think what I've enjoyed learning the most about for Pastor Chappell is his long history of community activism and other types of service. Not only was he a U.S. Navy veteran, he has a Bachelor's of Science in Civil Structural Engineering and a Master of Divinity degree, and he is currently completing a Doctor of Ministry in Cross-Cultural Engagement from Multnomah Biblical Seminary. He does lots of other work with his faith community, but he has a lot of other things he's also been doing in the larger community. He's a founder and director of Man Up, which is a community outreach program that addresses domestic, sexual, and gang violence by working on healing soul trauma in men and women. He recently served on the Council of Trust for the Oregon Cares Fund. His activist work with the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence actually ended up with him receiving a very distinguished award, the Midori Hamilton Award for leadership. And it was in 2018. And he is the only man and the only pastor who ever received that award in their 40-year plus history. He also is very active as a facilitator at the Call to Action for the Not One More Drop gang intervention program with the City of Portland, Multnomah County, the Gang Violence Task Force, and the Gang Enforcement Unit with the Multnomah County Court System. He's been recognized as, one of the most influential pastors in his faith community at the Church of God in Christ. And in addition to all of that, he is very committed to ongoing activity in reducing all of the racial tensions and trying to eliminate the racism that we see in our community. And as he was preparing a dissertation that had to do with racism and its evolution, he discovered an artifact in his research that impacts racism. And so we're very lucky that tonight he's with us. He's going to talk to you about the many things he's been doing and call us all to action, we hope. So with all of that, I would say, let's please turn this over completely to Pastor Chappell.
Well, good evening, and thank you, Carla. It is such a pleasure to be here take part on tonight. And it's so wonderful to see so many of my friends and people that I know that have also come out to support this effort on tonight. Just to name a few, there's several pastor friends who are here, Apostle Level Thomas, Pastor Devon Pierce. I saw Pastor January, and I think there's someone else that I saw, another friend, Ray Shellmeyer, and then a number of people from St. John's, my church, who are here with us tonight. And just, I can't call everyone, but also I saw someone from a group that I also serve with, New Wine, New Wineskins. And so I'm just delighted to be here, to be a part of this. My lovely bride of, as you mentioned, 46 years, she's unable to join us on this evening. She's speaking at another function, but she is just really excited about this and looking forward to reviewing the recording once this is done. But I just want to say I'm really thrilled to be able to speak on behalf of this topic on tonight. This is something that I'm very passionate about. And I'm sure that as we go into it, you'll find out how passionate I am. I just want to see us do what we can to end this ugly thing called racism. You mentioned that I am a civil structural engineer. I had a very exciting career as an engineer. One of the things that I did do is you see wind turbines, these wind generators that are built all around up in the Columbia Gorge and around. Well, I was a part of the research and development on the initial development of wind energy. In fact, I was a project manager, built the first prototype wind farm in the state of Oregon. So what you'll hear is when in my presentation, a lot of the terminology that I use comes from my engineering background. So construction, deconstruction, that kind of thing. So you'll hear that come through. That is just a part of who I am. And so just wanted to share that in case someone say, okay, where's he coming from? I thought he was a pastor. Well, yes, I'm a pastor and I did a dual thing. I served as an engineer as well as served as a pastor. And so, but I'm really excited to be here, and I'll go ahead and share my screen, and we'll see if we can get this right. Can you all see my screen?
Perfect.
All right, we did it. Sometimes this technology challenges me, but sometimes I make a mistake and I get it right. So, but I just want to say that again, I'm happy to be here at Take Part, which is the Portland Anti-Racism Team. And I am the pastor of the St. John's All Nations Church of God in Christ. We're located out in North Portland. And I've been there for 19 years. Have a wonderful congregation. I often say that we're the biggest little church in town. We may not have the large numbers, but our reach in the community goes very deep. And we do a lot of things in the community, and that's how we were able to meet Carla and John and Jane and the others at the Baha'i Center. And I think Larry Hill, who's another good friend, one who I've worked with a number of years doing community activist work, where I met Larry, and Larry introduced us and said, we need to get connected. And that's how we got connected with the Baha'i Center. And I just want to just share a little bit about why I am, this is something that's important to me as a pastor, and the things that really ground me, and that really establishes who I am, establishes my core values. It is a part of my lifestyle. And that is, I am unapologetically Trinitarian, which means that when I look at the God who I serve, he is 3 in 1. He's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, which makes up the Godhead. These three persons, but one God. And the three are in total unity. They are in total and complete commitment to the other. They are interconnected. They are interdependent and in full and total togetherness. And when I think about that, the three, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, are equal in authority, equal in power, and equal in glory. They're bound together by love. And the love of God presented to the world was through Jesus Christ. And it is because of Christ in my life that I am a reflection of the love of God to the world. And so I wanted to share that, because just so that you'll understand the position that I take and where I come from and what grounds me in this work. And it is love. I believe that everything that I do, it must be shrouded and portrayed and presented in love. As I think about the human race, we human beings are all created in God's image. And we all came from the same father and mother, who are Adam and Eve. That makes us all of the same human family. No matter what we look like, we all started with the same mother and father. And if we are family, the question is, why so many family feuds? Why are the family feuds going on? What about the sibling rivalry that we have among us? Why the divisiveness by race if we are of the same family? One thing that Eric Mason said in The Woke Church, a book that I've read, it really kind of struck me. He says, family loves on one another. Family takes care of one another. Family is patient with one another. And he goes on to say, if I'm honest, there are times when I don't want to be patient with some of my siblings who struggle to get it when we talk about these issues of racism and justice. And I know that talking about race and racism can be very tiring, can be wearying, but they are conversations that must be had. And that's what we're doing tonight. And just want to say that as we go through this presentation, you may have questions. If it is a burning question, put it in the chat, or if you have a question, most of your questions, hold them to the end, because we will have time to come back and have some dialogue. I definitely want to have some conversation, dialogue among us. But when I think of racism, racism is a social construct. It is a social system that has taken on a life of its own. It has its own value systems. It has thus become institutionalized. And racism has found its way into every institution in our nation. It is the outgrowth of chattel slavery, which chattel slavery is the ownership of people, seeing them as property. And the chattel slavery in this country, the outgrowth of that chattel slavery has caused us to racism to be institutionalized. And as we know it today, it has stemmed from the doctrine of discovery. And the doctrine of discovery, I love how you identified and gave accolades to those who of indigenous people and the nations that were here prior to any person who came into this land. There were people who were already living here. But the doctrine of discovery, it was the papal bull, the Dum Diversus, which was issued on June 18th, 1452 by Pope Nicholas V. And it initiated the very first set of documents that would eventually be composed and become known as the Doctrine of Discovery. And what that Doctrine of Discovery did, it gave King Alfonso V of Portugal, it basically gave him the rights to go into lands as explorer. His explorers were going into these lands that were not European. They were had the right to go and to take over possession of those lands, to take possession of the people, to take possession of the resources, and whatever those they found of value, they were given this right where they could take possession and ownership. And even the people who were there basically could be put into perpetual slavery. But this whole process basically was fed off of greed. And so you'll hear a lot about the doctrine of discovery in your study and research of racism. And one thing that has happened as a result of the doctrine of discovery, of chattel slavery, and as these systems have been put in place, the systems of racism that have become institutionalized. And when we talk about systemic racism or institutional racism, basically they are one in the same, because there are systems that were put in place that cause racism to be entrenched in our society. And as I said, that they were socially constructed. And those, because they have become institutionalized, these systems have become institutionalized, individual racism has become a part of that. People have become racist individually because of the systems and the structures of institutional racism and the influence of the institution that has had on the psychic of individuals. And whatever those institutions were, whether they're the educational system, our judicial system, our law enforcement system, our religious systems, you name it. Every system in our nation is institutionalized, and racism has infiltrated those institutions. And when I think about racism, racism is sin. It denigrates the human to less than. We find that when we see that the slaves, African slaves, were recognized as 3/5 of a human being, less than human. And so therefore they could account them as property and not humans. This racism, this sin of racism, carries with it a spirit of death. And that death, the emotional death, spiritual death, financial death, as well as physical death. Racism is shrouded in death. It brings about death. It's designed to use up a person until they die. There's a scripture in James that I like to share. It says, let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then, when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. And again, that temptation is fed off of greed. And as we have said, racism is steeped in greed. That institution was established off of greed, and it has denigrated humans to the point of being less than. As a result of that, of this institutional racism, we live in a racialized society where racism, as I mentioned, is and has been socially constructed. And our next slide is, since our racialized society was socially constructed, it also can be socially deconstructed. And to socially or to deconstruct racism, it has to be first called what it is, and that is sin. And that's racism is called out as sin. It must be recognized for what it is. It must be acknowledged and then intentionally dismantled. And so that recognition, oftentimes we find that because the conversation or when the subject of racism comes up, it is something that is uncomfortable. It creates tension, and people just don't want to engage in the subject, in the conversation. But it must, in addition to being recognized, it must be acknowledged. And once it is acknowledged, it must be intentionally dismantled. And when I say intentionally dismantled, that means there's a deliberate act that must take place in order to deal with it. It's not going to go away by ignoring it, but there must be an intentionality to get rid of this evil. It dismantled one person at a time, and that comes through education, And when we say education, it's not just the education that is available. There must be research, because a lot of the education, a lot of people don't even know, have not even heard of what the Doctrine of Discovery is, of what it does. The dumb well, the Doctrine of Discovery and what that is all about, or how slaves got to be enslaved and become chattel in the United States. We just know about slavery, but that's about the end of it. No, we really need to dig and do the research, become educated on the parts of education that was either revised or that was tucked away in the dark corners and not touched. But there must be research. And then once there is understanding, then the conversations must be had. There must be conversations, because those conversations will bring light and shed light on the truth. And these conversations do not ignore or cancel the stories. Personal stories are very enlightening, because they will help a person understand what racism has done, and it's best to go outside of your normal sphere of influence and have conversations with people who don't think like you, look like you, act like you, or in all ways like you. Go outside of those circles, because you're going to find that that education that you get will be phenomenal and be very rich. And you'll have those rich and deep conversations. And so having these one person at a time will be just amazing. And your life will be so enriched by having those. And so again, in some of those stories will seem to be unbelievable, but they are very believable. When I think about myself and I look back on my life, I started school in the late 50s and into the early 60s. And that was during the time before civil rights really got going in the process, when it was really becoming in the limelight in our nation. There was a lot of marches, there was lots of speeches, and there were some bad things that happened during that time as well. But I went to basically white schools. There were a few Blacks that went to these white schools, and we had teachers who were sympathetic to the Jim Crow era and did not really support integration, even though I grew up in Northern California. There were still Jim Crow sympathizers in that area. And so I had those struggles. I experienced a number of things. And talking about the institution of racism, there were in my class, I didn't realize what was happening until later on in life, that I realized what I was exposed to. But there were those who were Nazi sympathizers. I saw a lot of Nazi symbols from the students. I saw a lot of the hangman nooses all over the place. I mean, the names that denigrated Blacks. I mean, these things were happening and all around, and because of the institution and making these things normalized, they seem just to be normal. And I didn't realize that until later on in life, that I realized what I had been exposed to from the teachers as well as the students. And so it's important to have these conversations and to hear the stories, because without that, we may miss something about the educational part. And then once we've heard the stories, we devise a plan. Sometimes we want to get to the action before we can really get the education or the conversation. But my encouragement is, let's get the education before we move into action. When I saw what was how basically the whole world was impacted by George Floyd, and there were marches, there were speeches, people were talking, but one of the things that really hurt me, even when I saw all of that, because I realized that this was something that unless there was real action, it would dissolve and go away. And that's what we have seen. We've seen the conversation stop. We've seen the action stop. We've seen the marches stop. There may be groups here and there, but it's not widespread like it was, because there was no real plan enacted and put into place. And so one person at a time. Don't ever think that you as an individual is unimportant in this work, because every individual is important. And one of the things that I did in the process of my dissertation for my doctorate is I developed what I call the triangle of racialization. And what this triangle is, it is a graphic to help people who really want to understand what racialization looks like in themselves or in the institution. It is an optic that can be used to see how racism works in our society, and really come up with plans to eradicate or deconstruct it. This triangle of racialization, what I have here, I have definitions of that. And in this blue area is what I call racism by intent. These are the people who are intentionally and proud of being racist. They are the ones who believes in racism. They are intentionally racist. They are overtly and covertly racist, and they live their life to ensure and to promote racism. So that's in this area of blue. Up in the yellow, we have what is called the racism by default. And these are those persons who are a part of, they just live their life. And as I mentioned earlier about the school that I went to, where there were the racial practices that were just normal. And a person can live in our nation, and because of racism has been institutionalized, racial practices have become normalized. And people will exhibit racial habits, racial conversation, racial practices and deeds, and that can happen unintentionally and ignorantly. This person gives little thought to racism, don't really think about what it is, or may even defend their position on race and where on their belief system, thinking that what they say or what they do is okay to do this. They believe what they do, with the exception of a few, that all things are equal. They'll see that, well, everybody does the same. I've been in conversation with a number of people and talking about racism. They say, well, everybody experiences that. Everybody's like this. Everybody's like that. Well, no, everybody's not like that. You have just, because of the default, racism by default, and the institution, again, remember I said that it has taken on a life of its own. It has established its own value systems. And when we buy into that, it just becomes normal. And we find many Americans are in this category. in the racism by default, and it's just the normal, everyday acts. And these are the ones that we really are trying to reach and move them into this third category, which is here in the green, which is anti-racism by intent. It has to be intentional. As I shared, that there has to be education, and that education has to be intentional. It has to be deliberate. There's work to be involved and that work to be done because there's research. You're going to have to dig for the information that's not readily available or that's not put out there in the public. So these persons are those who are anti-racist by intent. They're intentionally non-racist, have become educated and, are doing those things to educate themselves, to understand the symbols, to understand the language, to understand the thought process, and are intentionally changing themselves to not be influenced by the institution, but are being deliberate in changing, and then are engaged in the conversations to change the thoughts of others in their sphere of influence. And so what does this look like? Those who practice racialization, those in the blue are, or the racism by intent, are those who are the Ku Klux Klan or the skinheads, the Aryan nations, other hate groups, and those who promote hate every chance they get. Oftentimes they will deny being racist, but they will be a part of these racialized groups. The racism by default sector are those who gives a pass on racism. They defend his or her beliefs because they have been institutionalized. They promote unintentionally these racial practices. They may not even understand or recognize that they're promoting those, but they're actually promoting them because they have been influenced by the institution. They may be naive to their personal practices, or they just do what they've learned to do, okay? And until they have been exposed to something different, it's just normal to do that. They do not think or care about racism. Oftentimes, they think racism is not important. Talking about it is not important. It's not an important thing. Everything is okay. Just leave it alone and stop making such a big deal of it. That's oftentimes their attitude in the racism by default sector. And then, or they'll think that racism is overblown and people make too much of it. But then we have the third sector, and this is the racism, anti-racism by intent. And this is those who have decided and recognized and become awakened to the fact that there is a racist institution, and they have decided that they are not going to be a part of that nor promote it. So they have intentionally educated themselves and learned what racism looks like. They become intentional about being anti-racial, okay? They will often become leaders in conversations, discussions, workshops, or in other words, informing others about the evils of racism, talking about racism, what it looks like, and becoming advocates and ambassadors of anti-racial acts. And they do not allow the default to get a pass or to be excused. They will call it out when they see it. They will call it out for what it is. And we talked about that acknowledgement that takes place. One thing that I did in my dissertation, and a part of in the artifact that I did in this artifact, it is developed into a workshop, and I used the scenario of driving while Black. And I use that because what I found is everybody has an opinion about driving while Black. And I've had people say, well, I don't have an opinion about driving while Black. Well, that is, again, an opinion. And so driving while Black, it is not something that we're trying to decide if it is real. It definitely is a real thing that happens in our society. I have many stories as a Black man of driving while Black. And sometimes even now, when driving down the street at my age, when I see a police or I drive up alongside of a police or I see, that thought always comes in my mind, are they going to stop me? And if they do stop me, how will it end? That is always a thought in my mind every time I see a police officer, because of my experiences that I've had in the past. And I know that there have been times that had I made the wrong move or said the wrong thing, I would not be here right now to even have this conversation with you. And it's very traumatizing. And there's many Blacks, especially Black men, have those stories. I was talking to a white person a while back, and they were saying, well, I don't know anything about this driving while Black. I said, you know, as a white person, if you were to ask your friends, every man you know, how many have been stopped for driving while white, probably none or very few will even say or tell you that. But if you ask a Black person, how many have been stopped for driving while Black, almost everyone would respond that they have that experience. That's how widespread this thing is. And so what I've done is, on this triangle of racialization, I've used this to help people sort out and flesh out their deep-seated emotions and thoughts that they have not even thought about when it comes to the racialization or the institution of racism. And I do have a number of self-inventory questions or comments that I use. And each one of these are designed to cause a person to think. In our workshops, they are to get people discussing and having conversation and in group settings and just to help flesh them out. And then once that's done, on this triangle, you see, you can place yourself anywhere on here. But the thing is to be truthful about yourself, about your thoughts, about what is happening when you ask these questions. And you can place yourself anywhere in any one of these spectrums. You see, I've taken the lines away where you can just place yourself anywhere on here. And the first question is, are these persons who do not believe that profiling exists? There are people out there that don't believe that, okay? They believe that the police only make stops when there is a violation and when necessary. If the person just happened to be Black, they must have done something wrong. And if the persons comply with the police, there will be no trouble. Now, I had a white person tell me this, and you know, I just had to shake my head. It's like, this person doesn't even have a clue of what they're even saying, because that obviously this is not true. And I think we have seen some of this happen. But the fact is, people believe that. And if this is you, you know, have that conversation with yourself. Why is it that you believe this? Why is this a position that you would take. Another self-inventory response comment is persons who will dismiss police profiling as a coincidence. Again, they see nothing wrong with the police stops. If the person being stopped just happened to be Black, it was not because the police were profiling, but just a coincidence. Okay, and there are those who may be in this place. And again, you have to be honest with yourself in order to benefit from this exercise. Persons who think that profiling is needed to curb violence, and if it leads to an arrest, it was all justified. They think that Black people deserve what they get and that the police are just doing their jobs. They see nothing wrong with the police stopping Blacks, and if they end up getting shot, well, they should have complied with the police's commands. And I was in a conversation with an individual following the George Floyd case, and this individual, I asked, what did you feel when you see the officer on the neck of George Floyd? And this individual responded to me, I feel nothing. So I have no emotions. There's nothing there. My only thought is, I need more information. I don't have all of the information. And I ask again, you have no feelings when you see that, and no passion about that? He says, no, none whatsoever. And that really pricked my heart because, but what I saw is there are people out there who are in that position as well, who think like that. And so again, these self-inventory statements are designed to flush out where you are. And in the workshops, the conversation may even go beyond police profiling, because what happens is it causes people to open up and begin to share their stories. And that's where education really takes place. That's where these stories really begin to come forward. We find that people begin to dig deep within the depth of their heart and soul and better understand what the institution has done to and for them. Another one, persons who believe that there are rare occurrences where profiling is done only by a very few rogue cops. They believe that the police are all honorable except for the few bad apples, and that profiling generally does not exist. And there are people, again, who are there. Continuing on, persons who see the Black person's perception as their reality, even though they do not believe or see it that way themselves. These people, however, will at least acknowledge that there could be a problem. And I've seen in some of the workshops that I've done where people are beginning to wake up when they hear the stories, they begin to realize this thing is real, okay? Another one, persons who believe that profiling does indeed exist and that profiling is wrong, okay? There are those who believe this. Persons who personally know of someone who has been profiled while driving while Black and have strong thoughts and feelings about police profiling and believe that it should be stopped, okay? That police profiling is wrong and it must be stopped, okay? Or there are those who maybe one of these potential responses speak to you, or none of these responses speak to you or for you concerning your personal thoughts and beliefs. If not, please provide your own personal thoughts and explain. And again, it gives room for more dialogue and more conversation, because conversation in this topic, it is extremely vital that we have conversations when we're talking about race and racism. And finally, you're asked to think through what feelings and emotions you might have had you been the Black driver, and then provide your thoughts on the possibilities of what you think racial disparity might look and feel like. And again, it's asking the person to put themselves in the shoes of the other and just think about the emotions. What would it be like if you were in that place? If you were being talked to like this, if you were being treated in such a way, and just think through, and it's going to take some imagination, especially if you've never been there. But by talking through and having conversation with others, it will help to begin to open up your mind and your heart to begin to understand what this evil looks like. And then on this triangle, again, find a spot. Where would you place yourself? Would it be up here in this point at the top? Would it be here in the middle? Would it be on the line between racism by default and anti-racism by intent? Or would it be over in the blue, racism by intent? Where would you, after going through this exercise, truthfully place yourself? And again, this is an exercise that it only works when you're really open and honest with yourself, and when you have those open, honest, as well as difficult conversations. And so as we begin to wind down here, one of the things that Jesus said in St. John chapter 17, he says, I do not pray for these alone, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, that they all may be one, as you, Father, are in me, and I in you, that they also may be one in us. And it is that oneness, we talked about the oneness of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We talked about us as human beings being created in the image of God, where we really are to reflect that love that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit have with one another. And if we are to do that as members of the human family, seeing our brothers and sisters, everybody as a brother or sister, not as the other, not as less than human. If we can see one another, I think we can be well on the road to deconstructing racism. And so when thinking about that, is the question that really we need to grapple with is, how do we overcome this death? How do we be anti-racist by intent? It must be intentional. Or how can we deconstruct our racialized society? Many of us, if we really think about it on our jobs, what kind of racism is experienced on your job? If there's no people of color on your job, why not? If there are people of color on your job, how are they treated? What kind of things do they have to deal with just to stay there? They probably have never even had a conversation with you, if you're white, about the things that they deal with on the job. I know when I was an engineer, I dealt with it a lot, especially in the position that I held. But one of the things, because I was in leadership and in a high profile position, high leadership, because of the position that I had and the authority that I had, there were things that I was able to deal with. And just to share a story, I was the project manager on a project. It was a $180 million project that my company was, we were, had partnered with another company out of Houston, Texas. There were actually 3 partners, but this company out of Houston, Texas, I had to go to it was one of the partnership meetings, and it was my first time going. It was shortly after I had been assigned to this job. And when I went into this corporate office, it was a 40-story building. Their conference room, corporate conference room, was on the top floor, beautiful view overlooking Houston. But when I walked into the conference room, I introduced myself and that I was there with the company, and I named my company. There was a individual who I noticed he looked very strange and he left the room. And he was gone probably 5-10 minutes, and he came back. I didn't know where he had gone or what had transpired in those few moments. But I noticed that he would not speak directly to me, but he would speak to me through somebody else. He never shook my hand. He never addressed me. He acted as if I did not even exist. But when I got back to Portland, I was told that he had called the president of my company and said that this Black guy had come into their corporate conference room and said that he was representing my company. And my president, I have to give him kudos. And he said, yes, he is representing. Cliff is our man on this job. He is representing my company. And he said, if you're going to do business with us, you will deal with him. And so the man came back, and, you know, he had to adjust his attitude because he did not want to lose out on this $180 million project. And so, but I said that because these are some of the kind of things that go on that oftentimes we never even have conversations about. And so to deconstruct those, we need to have these stories. We need to have these conversations. It's important that we interact with people who may not look like us, talk like us, or be like we are. And it's okay to lament these things, because when you begin to deal with this, it's going to hurt. It is going to cause you some sleepless nights. It will cause you to cry because of the ugliness of it. And as I said, it is sin, it is death, it breeds death. And it's okay to lament. But once you lament, let's do something about it. And my last slide is, so where do we go from here? We're talking about anti-racist by intent. It must be intentional. Relationships must be developed. When I pastored a church in Casper, Wyoming, and in the process of building that church, building a congregation, I would go out I would pick a community. Every Saturday, I decided I would take an hour, hour and a half, not take a long time, but every Saturday I would pick a community and go pass out flyers and invite people to come to church. I did that consistently. Every Saturday I did that. And what happened is people started showing up at church. And when they showed up, I looked around one Sunday and all these people were there, but there was whites, there was Asian Americans, there was the Native Americans, there were the Hispanic Americans, there was the African Americans. And these people were in the congregation, but they were separated. They were in the congregation, but sitting in their own groups. And when I got up to preach, I looked, and it just really struck me so funny when I saw that. And I just couldn't contain myself. I just busted out laughing. And so I asked the congregation, I said, I want you, everybody here, to stand up, look around, and tell me what you see. And when they looked and they saw that, all of a sudden it hit. Laughter just broke out over the congregation. I said, here's what I want you to do. Get up, cross the aisle, go sit by somebody who you did not write with, who don't look like you, or whatever. Just let's mix this up. And we did, and something so beautiful happened in that congregation. It became family. The love that began to permeate through that congregation was just it was so wonderful. It was so awesome. And so to take it to another step, I began to encourage the congregation, different families, take another family home with you after service, fix a meal together, fellowship together, and get to know one another. Let them go and experience life in your own home. And as they did that, it really began to break up a lot of those old preconceived notions, those stereotypes that they had about other people. It really began to break down that stuff. And such a beautiful thing happened in that congregation because people began to develop real relationships, and they developed a love for one another. And so we must acknowledge the human dignity in everybody. And that's what happened. Instead of using our differences to divide us, the differences were used and celebrated. And we must celebrate our differences instead of yet letting them be used to divide us. And these open discussions and conversations, they will eradicate and deconstruct and get rid of all of those false ideas and those things that causes us to be divided. And so if we're going to be intentional about being anti-racist and do it with intent, there are some things that we must do. We must educate, must communicate, and then take some action. And so again, this brings me to the end of my presentation. And I know that there are probably some questions, there's some conversation that needs to happen. And, you know, let's dialogue with one another. Let's talk about what we've just heard.
That sounds like a great idea. Just a quick reminder for you all, because there's so many on the screens, just if you can, use your reaction button to raise your hand. It'll put you up at the top so we can see you easily. And if you can't do that, we'll be watching the chat as well. Thank you very much. Maybe as we get started. Oh, good. Pastor Marvin January. You are muted. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Yes, I dropped this in the chat earlier to no avail, but I said, we see the problems, it can't be denied, but are we willing to collectively prioritize and dialogue and then create some sort of a tangible plan that allows us to combat all of these systemic issues? I mean, I'm 52 years old. I still deal with microaggression once or twice, maybe 3 times a week. I'm an IT guy, I'm a network engineer. And when I go to all these different corporate settings, I deal, believe it or not, with a ton of microaggression. And as they say in Oregon, because I'm not from Oregon, I've only been here 12 years, you guys say stuff like, I got to let it roll off me like water off of a duck's back. Well, there needs to be a way to help people become more aware, because there are some of us who are still suffering in 2022. And then there are many people who are saying, well, let's see, does this really exist? Is this a thing? Of course it's a thing. Yes. That's why people are marching about it. But what's our plan? Who's willing to do something?
and Pastor January, thank you for raising that, because that's real. And that's one of the reasons I believe that, and I believe that God had me deal with this in my dissertation, because there needs to be, number one, shed light on it. There needs to be, these conversations have to happen. A lot of times, you know, when the conversation gets challenging, people want to walk away from it. I did a blog post here a while back, and I called it "Stand at the Table once the good stuff is gone." And the image of that is usually around a family dinner, Thanksgiving or whatever. You have the family come around, the table is set, it's all nice and pretty, you know, everything is all in place, the food looks good, but then after everybody's eaten, the food is all torn up, pieces are left, the plates are messy, there's probably crumbs on the table, but those who stay at the table in all of that mess, that's where real conversations take place. And that's where you really get into the real heart of what is going on in the families. And sometimes those conversations can become very weighty. They can become very, some of them ugly, okay, granted. But that's where you really begin to understand what's in a person's heart, is after dinner has taken place and you engage in those conversations. And racism is like that. We must be willing to stay at the table when all of the good stuff is gone, and stay and have those conversations, those challenging conversations. And if we can do that, what's going to happen is a person who probably never thought about racism is in that racism by default. Maybe they're going to wake up and realize, I'm in the wrong place. I need to do something about this. They'll be stirred in their heart to move and to become educated and to move into that, become anti-racist by intent. And so that's where I think the big thing here is we must have conversations, because one of the things that has happened is because we have not handled, we can talk about it, but if we don't really get down to the root of it, all we're doing is almost like swatting flies. Okay, we're not really dealing with the real issue. We have to get down to it, and so it takes education. It's going to take some conversation, and not conversation that throws around the myths and all of the stereotypes and things, but really deal with real truth. Okay, and then we can come up with some action, and oftentimes that action is more conversation, really engaging people who have not been awakened to the fact of what this institution, how it has influenced them individually. And I think once a person begins to realize that there is an institution and they are influenced individually by that, I think they'll really begin to move in the direction of being anti-racist by intent. And hopefully that answered your question, a part of it.
Yes, it did. And it brought up another one, because you hit something. Let's put it this way. You just hit the nail right in the center just a moment ago, because you kept talking about conversations, having conversations. But what's really in my spirit and in my heart tonight is simply this. It's so difficult to put people in a comfortable setting where they feel comfortable enough to engage with this, because let's be real, let's be honest. I'm one of those guys who just kind of keeps it real. So you guys have to excuse me. So I'm from Louisiana. I'm an old-fashioned boy. All right. So the issue that I see since I was 5 years old is that in many cases, the person who has been victimized wants to have a conversation. The person on the other side who has not been victimized is not so willing and open and won't make themselves available to have that conversation. So it's kind of incumbent on those of us from both sides, whoever's willing, to find a way to create an environment that's going to streamline this thing in a way that everybody feels comfortable. And otherwise, we won't have that conversation. So that's going to be another caveat that we want to consider in all of this.
And you make a great point, because one of the things that in these conversations that I've had, that white people, because they don't live it every day,
right,
can come into it, and when it becomes uncomfortable, can leave.
Yep.
A Black person lives it 24/7. You can't escape it. And so what we find is, like you were saying, we want to interact with people who can come into the conversation. And again, going back to my dinner table, are you willing to stay at the table when the good stuff is gone?
Yeah.
And so that's why it's important that we understand it has to happen one person at a time, and one person at a time. And there has to be some relationships. And as we develop relationships, we'll be able to interact with people. You'll be able to have those deep conversations and with people. But yes, these conversations that have to happen, and they have to happen individually, one at a time. But there are people out there. I believe that there are the whites as well as blacks who are willing to engage and stay in the conversation to get really to the root of it and to deal with these unpleasant conversations and issues, even when it gets ugly.
Right. I thought I saw a hand up from Ray. Reyes, would you like to go ahead and unmute yourself? I need you to unmute yourself, please. There you go.
Hi, Ray.
I'm Ray Shellmeyer, and I wanted to follow up on that piece about staying in the conversation. I'm a clinician by trade, so I do a lot of work in understanding human behavior, emotions, how we think, how we behave. And one of the things I noticed about this topic, it raises a lot of stress in all of us, you know, and that stress has its roots in not just our personal trauma, but our generational trauma, as well as our historical trauma. And it's very, very difficult to stay in any room when that stress response comes up, because you're going to just be ready to fight, flee, or be frozen. And without having a plan that helps you deal with trauma on those multiple levels, you don't have a chance of staying in a room when it gets into a situation like this, because the trauma actually is running deep in all of us. Historically, we've been given this from a societal standpoint as well, generationally within our families. And it started at our most informative years, from the time we were born to the age of 7. So it's all unconscious in us. And even probably talking about this today, if you just sat with yourself for a second, you would notice that you may have some type of sensation going through your body, some type of reflex happening in your body. Scientists have been able to coin the phrase the vagus nerve, the vagal nerve, the floating nerve. And if you do not do any work, you know, to help yourself heal and or metabolize your personal, generational, or historical trauma, we're never going to get anywhere with this, because it is such a brutal stain on our history, and it's really, really like hard to look at, and none of us want to be really associated with it, but we all are. And to get there, we have to dig in and heal whatever is going on within us, and then that will allow us to have presence, because to have conversation, we need to be present with one another so we can take action. Otherwise, that trauma within us is going to cause us to feel some anger or some hurt, some guilt, you know, and that takes our intellectual abilities completely out. It just throws them out the window, because it doesn't matter how smart or how talented we are. When the emotion kicks in, I'm telling you, it's just time to run, fight, or be frozen. That's it. Okay. So my encouragement to do this would be thinking about how we look at metabolizing trauma within ourselves. I try to encourage people to do things like set up groups. There's a great book out there that talks about racialized trauma that I would encourage everyone to take a look at. It's called My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem. You know, he talks about looking at the different groups. I think he says white bodies, black bodies, and blue bodies, and how each of us have experienced trauma based on the work that we do, the society that we are identifying with, and what that means in that, and doing work in those networks, you know, to metabolize our trauma, and then coming together collectively so we can have presence with one another. I can't underscore that, because it really allows us to meet each other, not just at the mind, but at the heart as well. Okay. And that's what's going to change this. There's a lot of people's minds, it doesn't matter. We have to look at it and see where the heart of each of us are, and to decide, are we going to be a connected humanity, or are we going to continue to have the separation that's been perpetrated for hundreds of years, and legalized for hundreds of years. And now we're here intellectualizing, going, we really don't want that to change, we don't really want that to continue, I'm sorry. But we don't have a chance unless we actually deal with this. There's a saying, before I seek the change that I want out in the world, I must look to see if any of that is in me. Okay, and I must become that before I can receive it. Okay, it's like a universal prayer or something like that. Be that, and the universe grants it. So that's all I wanted to say.
Okay, thank you very much. John Ing, you have your hand up?
Yes, thank you, Pastor Chappell. That was a wonderful presentation, and really appreciate, the comments about having to bring people together from different backgrounds in order to have those conversations in a way where you can develop, closer relationships rather than in these just big groups. And the effort, it takes a lot of work, and it takes years of commitment to do that. One example I have is I started in the position where I am now about 20 years ago, and I was out of a group of about 12 people, I was the only non-white, non-blonde-haired, blue-eyed person there. And it took quite a few years, and then I became the head of this little section here, and had to make concerted efforts to diversify that. So I was able to hire my first African-American employee, and she was under a lot of stress because she was the only Black person there, and felt that. So you have to make that effort to always connect and feel supported. I'm not Black, but I understand the stress that she's going through, and we worked together and started working towards creating a diversity team. And now, after working together for about 3-4 years, we have 3 African Americans out of this group of a little over a dozen, a Latino, Islander. So now she's working with us, and we've created this group that now extends through the institution. And she's walking around proud because she says, "Look, we're the most diverse group in this whole institution." And so now we're taking it further. So, if without that support, and I think those individuals who have a position to step out on the line and really go that extra mile and do the support, even though it's going to be hard and people want to give up, but if you stick through it and you're dedicated, we can make a change. And now we have, a diverse group, and you're together every day, and maybe there's some hard conversations, but if we work at it and have that constant interaction, and my management style is to make sure everyone has their say. So even, it's not top down, even though there's different levels of responsibility, make sure that in consultation, we go around and everyone has their say. And if they're not comfortable, they can pass. And if they want to come to me after and talk, that's fine. And just make sure everyone has their say. And when they're ready, let them share it. And we set those ground rules, just like at this meeting. There's not judgment. Everyone puts out an idea. They're all equally valued, and we work it out together. And I think with those conversations, we learn from each other and can, grow to love each other and really support each other.
Yes. Thanks, John.
I see Bernadette has her hand up, followed by Devin and then Randy. Bernadette.
Hi. I just wanted to ask a question of people who are white. How many interactions do you have with people of color? If you are in the workplace where there is no person of color, you must wonder, how do I do these things? And I would like to make suggestions. If you are a person of faith, I am not. There are many multiracial churches throughout Portland, and that is one place to do it. But there are many volunteer organizations that need assistance, from IRCO for immigration rights, SCI, the public schools. If you start helping children in the public schools, you will end up becoming exposed to people with experiences not like yours. You may meet their parents. You can do outreach. And it is not enough to read. You must try to put yourselves in the positions where you can meet people. But more importantly, when they talk and you're uncomfortable, please do not say, like my friends of 40 years said, can't we talk about something more pleasant? Because that is disrespectful and it actually can ruin a friendship. Please don't try to say, well, what about my poor white childhood? I can assure you it is not the same. And that was said to me by someone of 40 years of friendship. And so even people who love you can say the wrong things. Yes. But the biggest problem is the presumption that if affirmative action happens, people who might not be qualified will get in. And there are lots of people who see themselves as progressive liberal Democrats and supposedly friends of mine who actually believe these kind of things and have to be. And especially in your own families, when you are white and you are trying to grapple with these things, bring them to the table. You don't need a Black person there to start these conversations. If you are doing the work, start them in your own families and start asking people to challenge their misconceptions, because when you live in an all-white community, you haven't got anyone to break up those stereotypes for you.
Right.
And I would like to encourage you to think about doing those things. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bernadette. That was great. And like you mentioned, it's not easy. This is hard work, and we have to accept that. We have to accept being uncomfortable, but go and do those things, make those connections, step out of your comfort zone, and get the work done. And I guarantee you, you'll be rewarded.
Great. Devin, you have your hand up?
Indeed. Thank you, Dr. Chappell, for the presentation. And I think even some of the last points kind of speaks to just something that I wanted to mention, call it a small contribution to this conversation. But we talked about, commitment and willingness to come to the table and do the dirty work. And then the young lady who just spoke talked about, being willing as well. I think, again, there's a certain amount of strength and fortitude that has to happen to be willing to kind of address these hard conversations. I would even say by the makeup of this question and answer session, if I'm allowed to be frank, I see a lot of people of color, if you will, who are effectively, I'd call it advising or giving perspective to those who may not be people of color. And I imagine that's because there's even a fear of, my gosh, if I step up and have the answer, but yet haven't heard from those who are the marginalized, and generally none more marginalized than the African Americans, in my opinion. But then ultimately, I'm doing the wrong thing, or I'm setting myself up to be, kind of naysayed. And I would say that it takes a certain amount of courage to step out and have this conversation, even if you say what could be the wrong thing. I can appreciate that if you say the wrong thing and you're willing to listen to me give perspective or how it impacts me, then that's better if you don't say the wrong thing and you just think the wrong thing, and or if you act on the wrong thing, and or if you systemically keep me out of a job, out of a life-changing environment or opportunity because you've thought the wrong thing and you haven't engaged in a conversation that allows me to expand or give you different perspective. And so I'd say courage is something that I would ask for. I think it makes a difference. And that said, I appreciate everybody who's here, part of this conversation, because again, it says that, everyone here at the table has a willingness to to have some sort of conversation, right? Where I'd call this now the dirty table, you know, where we're starting to have that conversation. There's a little bit of food being eaten, you know, but there's starting to be some bones piled up. I'm gonna blame it on Pastor January. He started it, and you know, and so, but with that said, one last quick thing, and I apologize for already being too long. But the other thing is, there's a thing called engagement fatigue. I was part of a diversity committee with my last employer. I've worked in a lot of environments where I worked in Beaverton, where it was 600 people in the group I worked at, or not the group, but the company, and there were 2 African Americans. And then I worked at a nonprofit medical teams, a great organization, people of faith, doing great things in the community and abroad. But I was probably the only African American in a company of about 120. And so I was often called to be at the table and have these conversations. And there's a thing that I had that I'd call this engagement fatigue, or the advocate fatigue. And really, it boiled down to, I don't always want to be the person to have that conversation. Something that Dr. Chappell mentioned is, you know, we're consistently engaged as African Americans. We're not truly able to step back. You know, I live it, and I do drive home and count the cop cars, you know, sometimes, and depending on, and then as a 50-year-old professional with a few letters behind my name and everything else, that's still an impact, right? And so therefore, my ask is simply that you don't come to the table with expectation necessarily that the person that you're engaging with has the same desire. They may have been living it and doing it, and simply put, may just be a little bit fatigued. And so I would say, instead of bringing expectation, bring some understanding and grace to the fact that, you know, although now you're finally ready to have the conversation, they may not be as ready or prepared, and or simply just may not, you know, they might have to be dealing with real life and don't have the energy for that. And so I would just ask you again, you know, be the courage to have that conversation, and then the grace to appreciate if someone, you know, who you're looking to engage with does not want to, for the same reason, to have that conversation. And so with those things, I think it makes a difference. And everyone having or bringing their best self to the conversation and having some fruitful results.
Thank you very much. I just need to check in a little bit with Pastor Chappell. We usually commit to continue our conversation to 8:30, but then what we do is we'll come to a point where we'll end this, but we will stay on this conversational line and give anybody else who wants to have a chance to speak with Pastor Chappell a chance to do that. So I know there's 4 people who are ready to ask some questions, which I'm really excited to hear. At this point in the time, it's when I wish that all of us on this line could come back together and continue the conversation, because I hate to have any time when we're not all together. So I wanted to thank Pastor Chappell very, very much for your presentation. We always talk about wanting to leave these meetings with some action items, and you've given us the action items. You know, we all need to get educated. We need to then actually independently investigate what's really true and understand what's really happening, and then really get involved in acting and those conversations, one person at a time, every single one of us. So for that, I thank you very, very much on behalf of Take Part. Do you have any last comment you'd like to make before we end our evening? And then those who want to stay can feel free to stay, and we'll continue our conversation.
I would just like to say, I appreciate the conversation. I appreciate this opportunity to dialogue on this topic, and each of you who came into this session on tonight, I see you now as an ambassador, and you can take these conversations back to your sphere of influence. Sometimes these conversations can be very challenging and difficult. Some people just don't want to engage. Don't force it. Find those who are willing, because eventually those hard cases, somebody who you interact with will eventually get through to them. But don't back away from having these conversations with people who will engage. And one of the things that, I learned from the life of Jesus Christ, as well as what I did at the church in Wyoming, having meals together. That is such a powerful thing. Jesus would go into these homes and he would sit down and have a meal. That is such a powerful thing that sometimes we forget the essence of that. And they may not fix the same kind of food that you fix, but that's the beauty of it, where you're actually sharing and being involved in a person's life, and you would be amazed at how open a person will become when you do those kinds of things. And so I thank each of you for your willingness and your courage to engage, and may God just bless you in your future endeavors as you engage these conversations.